Just in terms of introducing myself, though, I'm Stephen Whitfield. I'm the director of the Global Food and Environment Institute. I'm also a professor in the School of Earth, Environment and Sustainability here at the University of Leeds. As I said, my talk this afternoon is titled Social Inequality and One Health Consequences in Food Systems Transformation in Southern Africa. But it is essentially my attempt to draw together some findings and reflections from across the FoSTA Health project. And FoSTA Health stands for Food Systems Transformation in Southern Africa for One Health. It was a Horizon Europe funded project. It's recently come to an end after 3.5 years. And I suspect there's several people in the audience that have been involved in one way or another in the project. In FoSTA Health, we aimed to better understand the interrelated human, animal and environmental health impacts of ongoing changes in Southern African food systems, and to look at how benefits and trade-offs of these changes are distributed across systems, geographies and societies. The project brought together 16 partners, including universities in Malawi, South Africa, Tanzania and Zambia, which are our 4 focal countries, as well as regional policy organisations, such as FANRAPAN, which is the organisation that Thembi represents, and also international development partners. Before talking more about what we did in the project, I want to briefly highlight some characteristics of the food systems that we've been working in. I know that some people in the audience will know these contexts really well, but there might be some of you that are less familiar. This is by no means comprehensive, and at the risk of talking in quite a generalized and sweeping way about what are actually very diverse contexts, I just want to highlight a few background things that are relevant to points that I want to elaborate on in the talk. So just some relevant things to have in mind. Firstly, that when we talk about Southern African food systems, these are typically quite dualistic in nature, in the sense that on the one hand, there are these formal, large-scale food production, processing and supply chains, but they coexist with much more informal, small-scale local systems of production and provision. And of course, it's these smaller scale and more informal agriculture and food systems that the majority of rural, low-income households are most directly engaged in. The second point is that across the Southern African region, the industrialization and marketization of agriculture and the expansion of agricultural export markets is really seen as a key development agenda, and an agenda for quite a wide variety of actors. It's evident in national policies, in private investments, and even in third sector and international development interventions. And across those interventions, this growth in agriculture is not just seen as being a vehicle for economic development, but it's also often tied to a whole range of more normative goals around, for example, women's empowerment and improving food and nutrition security. The third background point is that Southern African food systems operate within a context of relative market liberalization. So there's been this ongoing liberalization, like shaped by structural adjustment policies that go back to the 1980s, but also by more recent regional trade initiatives like the African Continental Free Trade Area. Having said that, governments do still play a very significant role, and they intervene and shape food systems in very significant ways through things like agricultural subsidies, marketing boards, by controlling land rights and land access. And these things are highly influential when it comes to shaping food systems, and they're also very highly political. And the final thing is, or my final background point is that there's a sort of ongoing urbanization of the population across the region, and an urbanization of diets, which is creating quite significant differences between rural and urban populations in terms of their food and nutrition access and their dietary health. Again, this is a broad generalization, but I would say within rural diets, there's a very high proportion of calories that are derived from maize. Diets are not particularly diverse, and there's high prevalence of micronutrient deficiencies in things like iron, folates, vitamin A. Whereas urban diets are diversifying, but not necessarily in more healthy ways. Consumption of highly processed foods, foods that are higher in sugar, fats, oils. And this has been associated with quite a rapid rise in obesity across the region. But of course, those things are contextual, and we see dietary differences across socioeconomic groups and across geographies. So in this Southern African context, across the project, we've been particularly interested in understanding the implications of some key transitions. The first of those being the increased engagement in export markets for high value commodity crops and cereals. The second being changes in agricultural practices, things like expansion of agricultural land area, and that includes large land acquisitions, but also things like investment in irrigation infrastructure. And thirdly, dietary transitions, particularly in urban areas, and particularly towards higher consumption of animal proteins, fats and refined oils. We recognise that these things are interlinked across the region, and in the project we've tried to maintain a whole systemic food system focus in our work, but we've approached that through some specific entry points and case studies, both in terms of the geographic locations that we worked in and the specific commodities that we focused on. So specifically, we focused on maize and soybean producing agricultural landscapes in Zambia's central province, on horticulture production and processing in Tanga district of Tanzania, on livestock in Gauteng province in South Africa, and on maize and legume mix systems in southern Malawi. This slide is just an illustration of some of the research from the project, just to give an indication of the variety of disciplines and scales and scope of the work that we've undertaken. So there's photos of our field ecology in Zambia, where we were analysing tick and mosquito distributions and abundance to look at the vector-borne disease risk under different land managements and landscapes. There's a schematic diagram of our experimental field trials that we ran in Malawi, of which there were 44 in total, and they were used to assess soil and plant health under different intercropping and fertilizer regimes. There's a screenshot of a database on animal disease and livestock production and processing that we collated and analysed in South Africa. And there's also some images of participatory work on women's empowerment and agricultural livelihoods from Tanzania. I wanted to briefly mention also a key thread throughout the project that we've had on trying to have meaningful engagement of diverse food systems stakeholders. We've run multiple local, national and regional stakeholder dialogues, and we've tried to use these as a basis, not just for disseminating the research from the project, but also co-designing and iterating that research to some extent, really to ensure that it's, where possible, responding to real, timely, practical and policy issues. And FANRAPAN have been a really key enabler of those engagements. So in the remainder of this presentation, I want to try and tell a bit of an overall story that brings together some of the different aspects of the work from across the project. And this is really a story about the socially unequal One Health risks associated with market or commercially oriented food system changes in the region. I'll just start with a couple of specific and connected consumption and production trends. So since the 1970s, the per capita and the total consumptions of animal-based proteins has steadily been on the rise across the region. It's a trend that is more pronounced among urban populations than it is in rural areas, and that dietary change has brought some benefits in terms of benefits from a nutrition perspective. But of course, it's also contributed to a surge in overall production of chicken, beef, and pork. In South Africa, the poultry sector, for example, has grown by 800% over the past 5 decades. And these growing South African livestock value chains have been also associated with a change in livestock farming and a distinct shift towards more intensification, particularly the emergence of cattle feedlotting and intensive chicken and pork production systems. Larger herd sizes and more mass transport of cattle under these systems is also affecting livestock disease spread. There's been recent and fast-spreading outbreaks of foot and mouth disease in South Africa, as well as periodic occurrences of cysticercosis, African swine fever, avian influenza, and other livestock diseases. This demand for meat and the intensification of livestock in South Africa has implications for agriculture elsewhere in the region. Soybean is one of the Zambian government's priority value chains under its National Agricultural Investment Plan. And in the last 5-year period, or the current 5-year period of that investment plan, the government has sought to double production of soybean through things like investing in improved seed varieties, establishing commercial farm blocks, investing in irrigation infrastructure. A growing part of the market demand for soybean comes from that feedlotting industry in South Africa. So quite a bit of Zambia's soybean is going to South Africa for livestock feed. It's also being produced and exported to China, in some cases on Chinese-owned farms in Zambia. And it's also going into the domestic market as well, not only for livestock, but also because there's actually a growing demand for oil and for plant-based proteins, soya chunks in particular, domestically within Zambia. with export markets in mind, in particular, the Southern African Business Development Forum, who have been a partner of ours on FoSTA Health, they've been supporting producers through training to comply with some of the sanitary and phytosanitary export standards around soybean. And I'll come back to issues around standards later in the presentation. This focus on soybean in Zambia, particularly for export, does have implications for domestic food and nutrition security. So Stuart Jennings and Russ Kane here at Leeds have been doing some analysis using integrated modelling tools to look at the potential that Zambia has to grow and provide sufficient food, and actually more specifically to provide sufficient nutrients to meet healthy dietary requirements for a growing population. And what that modelling is telling us is that, particularly in a context of population growth and climate change, meeting those domestic food needs is increasingly challenging. We modelled some alternative scenarios, and we found that under a scenario that is commercially export oriented, i.e. one that prioritises those Zambian government's priority value chains. Under that kind of future, there will be a particularly high need for agricultural land area expansion, and also a high reliance on imports in order to meet domestic nutrition requirements in Zambia. Of course, if agricultural land area expands, then we need to consider the ecological impact of that. Under another strand of research in the project, we've been looking specifically at the impact that agricultural land use and agricultural land expansion in soybean growing areas in central province of Zambia has on ecosystem services, and the consequence of those ecosystem service changes for exposure to crop pests and diseases. So Hemant Tripathi actually gave a much more detailed presentation on that aspect of research as part of this same webinar series a couple of months ago. And it's well worth checking out his webinar if you'd like to know more about his research. But essentially that research showed that encroachment of agricultural land into forested areas leads to reductions in natural enemies for crop pests and disease vectors, and it potentially increases direct human exposure to these disease vectors, things like malarial mosquitoes, for example. The research also demonstrated that there are ecosystem co-benefits that come with maintaining a more mixed or mosaic agriculture forest landscape. Of course, if we expand agricultural land and if this creates increased crop pest pressure, then pest management becomes a greater challenge. And our research on pesticide use in soybean production in Zambia, which was led by Aaron Siunda, that's highlighted some potentially negative practices from a One Health perspective. We've observed instances of farmers exceeding recommended application rates of pesticides, not having adequate PPE, misusing pesticides, for example, by applying paraquat to accelerate pre-harvest drying of soybean in fields. And analysis within the project found high concentrations of several hazardous pesticide compounds, both in agricultural soils and in household dust. And we know that exposure and vulnerability to those hazardous chemicals is uneven. Young children, pregnant and lactating women, elderly, all face particularly acute health risks from pesticide exposure. So just to summarize that, this overuse and overexposure to pesticides is exacerbated by a perceived trend towards increased crop pest damage, which in turn is exacerbated by agricultural land expansion that is feeding market-driven growth in the sector. I just also want to return to a point about regulation and standards quickly, and particularly within export markets. So another aspect of our work in FoSTA Health has looked at the different risks that smallholder farmers face, particularly when entering into export-oriented supply chains. Jonas Cromwell has done some work on avocado supply chains, avocados being another of those key priority value chains in both Tanzania and Zambia. And his work shows that with this shift from domestic to export-oriented production, the burden and cost of food quality standards, particularly those imposed by importing destinations like the EU, tend to get pushed all the way down to low-income, small-scale producers, often through a series of quite unequal supply chain interactions. In some cases, middlemen or buyers negotiating low prices for fruit that they claim to be non-compliant. And farmers themselves have little bargaining power and limited access to information. And that sort of coupled with the highly perishable nature of avocados means that farmers really limit their ability to get fair prices for their produce. There are lots of initiatives in the region to try and improve farmers' agency and access within markets, particularly through forming cooperatives and offering training. And some of our work has looked critically at some of those initiatives as well, which I'd be happy to kind of talk more about in the Q&A, but I'm going to just skip through for the sake of time. So in amongst the potential benefits of expanding the agricultural sector and growing agricultural export markets, our work highlights a lot of these interconnected negative outcomes and social inequalities that can result. So what recommendations do we reach about how to better govern food system transitions and how to address inequalities within these complex systems? Well, across the project, we actually co-develop over 100 different recommendations for different stakeholders at different levels and we've done that through our dialogues that I mentioned earlier. I'm not going to go through all those in detail, but I want to summarize 4 broad groupings of recommendations. So the first point is about striking a balance in the liberalization of trade. In Africa, harmonization of trade and cooperation with neighboring countries is really key to having a resilient and prosperous food sector, and for making sure that regulation can be established and introduced in a way that's appropriate to the region, rather than being imposed from the EU, for example, when exporting outside of the region. But there's a need to balance that liberalization with a degree of protectionism. We know that free trade is unlikely to sufficiently provide food and nutrition security for the poorest or protect the livelihoods of the most marginalized producers. And so a degree of protectionism can offer some social security, can help to maintain food reserves and control prices in a way that shields small-scale producers from the sort of volatility of international markets. The second point is about the need for restricting and regulating harmful practices, regulating pesticide sales and usage, regulating the buying practices of middlemen, regulating the marketing of unhealthy foods. A lot of those negative influences need that formal monitoring and control. But at the same time, we argue that regulation needs to be balanced with support, particularly for resource poor farmers and consumers, to be able to access positive alternatives, whether that's promoting agroecological practices, whether it's giving farmers better access to information so that they can negotiate fair prices and contracts, whether it's incentivizing and subsidizing healthy and nutritious dietary choices. The third point is about taking a systems approach to policy, avoiding siloed approaches that prioritize economic growth separately from concerns for nutrition, biodiversity, or land rights, for example. There's a danger that those things become sort of externalities or negative consequences of a growth agenda. And we really advocate for taking a more food systems and One Health approach to national level planning and policy. And the final point is about the importance of incorporating local and marginalized voices within the governance of food system change. So there are, as we've talked about, negative outcomes that disproportionately affect resource poor and marginalized producers and consumers. And those people in turn have the least agency when it comes to shaping policies and processes that govern food system change. So we advocate for more meaningful inclusion of local voices and knowledges to help identify those policies and interventions that can really adequately address inequality. I've given there a very brief summary of a very large amount of work, and there are some aspects of the project that I haven't even touched on, but I want to keep time for questions. But in the absence of going into all of that detail, let me direct you to 3 reports that we've produced and that you can look at if you want to find out more. The first is an extended synthesis of our analysis of food system transformation pathways. The second is a policy briefing, which really distills down some of our recommendations. And the third is a research handbook, which has presents some of our own critical reflections on power and participation within our own work and how we've gone about the research in the project, recognizing that there's potential that we sort of inadvertently kind of exacerbate some of those inequalities if we don't go about our research in the right way. So that handbook has some of those reflections and learnings. And I think we can try and circulate a copy of those reports to everyone that's registered for the webinar. So let me finish there. I think I can hand over to Thembi just to introduce herself and then guide us through a quick Q&A. Thembi, are you there?
Thank you, Stephen. And good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My apologies that I was not able to join right from the start because of a technical issue, but I've been here throughout the session, throughout the presentation, just on the sort of webinar participant side of things. So my name is Sithembile Mwamakamba. I am the Director of Policy Research and Analysis at FANAPAN. I think Stephen did talk a bit about FANAPAN, but I think for me, the other exciting thing is that I'm also a steering committee member of the Global Food and Environment Institute. So this is really sort of working out well because I am managing to support the institute in a way. Stephen, thank you for such an insightful and thought-provoking presentation. I've been part of the FoSTA Health journey, but it's always, good to hear it as a whole, because if you are working in one work package, you tend to sort of really focus on delivering that. But hearing the story of the project from you as a whole, I think it's amazing. And your presentation has really helped us appreciate just how interconnected food systems, inequality, environmental stability, and health outcomes are across Southern Africa. And I think one of the strongest messages that came through for me is that food systems transformation is never only about production or markets, but it's also about who benefits, who bears the risk, and whose voices are included, and how we balance economic priorities with equity, nutrition, and environmental sustainability. So it's been like a really wholesome presentation that's looking at food systems wholly. And I think I was particularly struck by the discussion around the unintended consequences of increasing market-driven food systems, especially for the small scale and resource poor producers. So thank you for ending it with the sort of practical and policy relevant recommendations in the end. And I think at this point, we'll now want to move into our Q&A session. I've been trying to keep track of the Q&A. I see that there are no questions that are raised there. But maybe perhaps to get the conversation started, and whilst people are busy typing in their questions in the chat, I think reflecting on Vanapan's participation in the project and also just listening to you now presenting the project as a whole, I think some of the things that you highlighted includes the tensions between commercialization, export orientation, and local food and nutrition security. So my question, I think, yes, Sarah, thank you, Sarah. So there are two questions, but maybe let me finish my question and then I'll get to the two questions. I guess my question, looking at that tension between commercialization, export orientation, and local food and nutrition security, is how can governments better balance these competing priorities, especially under growing pressure for economic growth and trade integration? I think there's always this challenge that food security needs have to be met, but at the same time, we need to expand, the production, and we need to go into new markets and that sort of thing. So how can governments better balance these competing priorities?
Yeah, it's a big question. I think there is an important role for governments to play in that protectionism that I talked about. So this commercialization is going to happen whether the government are encouraging it or not. In a way, there's a sort of private sector drive in that direction. So it's really important that whilst sort of promoting and enabling some of that economic activity, the government intervenes in a way that protects the prices, the rights, the access to food of those that are most vulnerable within their countries and their constituencies. So I think it's through those interventions, whether it's price protection, whether it's marketing boards, whether it's social security initiatives that give food vouchers or support for accessing food to the poorest, that we really advocate for the government to step in to ensure that as that commercial agenda gains steam, that those inequalities don't become even worse.
Thanks, Stephen. I think good point, but I was also just reminded how sometimes government stepping in some of our countries has gone terribly wrong, especially thinking about the input subsidy program and how at times it can often be disruptive. But I think my question is close to, is it Shade's question? Who is saying, how do we engage governments and policymakers to reduce siloing and embrace food system thinking, siloing.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think again, I think it's a really important kind of message to government that these problems are systemic, and if we focus on one part of the challenge and not the whole system, then you get these negative consequences that might be unintended. So actually, some of the governments in the countries that we're working in are taking steps towards having a much more holistic approach to food system policy. Having some of those things sit within cross-ministerial agencies like national planning commissions, I think is a potentially very sort of positive approach. We see that in Malawi, for example. Zambia has adopted a national One Health strategy that is a product of several different ministries and agendas sort of coming to a collective One Health systemic sort of objective. So I think those kind of initiatives that are already happening to some extent are really important in this sort of complex systems space.
Yeah. And I think probably the good thing about projects like FoSTA Health that happen across countries is there is that opportunity for cross-country learning as well. If one country is doing well, can always share some lessons with another. All right, so we have another question here from Cameron. Cameron is asking if you can talk more about the cooperatives and training for smallholder farmers.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Yeah, so I mentioned that cooperatives is one of the ways in which governments and international development organizations are trying to support farmers to sort of manage some of these risks of market engagement. So having groups of small producers coordinate, cooperate to pool their production, to collectively negotiate for better prices, to access training, to access loans through those cooperatives. And there can be kind of real benefits to that. Some of our work in Malawi and Tanzania has also revealed some of the problems and challenges that can come with being part of a cooperative, particularly some of the social pressure and exclusion that can come if you are a member of a cooperative that is not able to service loans, or that in some way kind of disadvantages the rest of your cooperative members because of your kind of production or your financial situation or whatever else. Some of those cooperatives are often like targeted at women specifically, or women's only groups and women's only associations, and that they're explicitly with this objective of empowering women, which again, they can be an effective means to that. But some of our work also actually at quite a fundamental level, it has challenged some of those ideas that women's empowerment is about resource access and market access and money. For a lot of the groups that we worked with, we found that the aspirations of those individuals don't necessarily align with that sort of market agenda and that sort of resource-focused understanding of what empowerment is. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that. And I mean, talking about power issues, I think it's a good segue to Sarah Gonzalez's question. It's a bit of a long question. But she's asking if you got a sense or got a chance to understand who are the corporate players behind and pushing this liberalization. As you mentioned, some of these trends go back to SDA programs and the entry of foreign investment. Are there any particular corporate players, perhaps companies based in US or Europe, that are commercially benefiting from these changes? And she would appreciate that. She appreciates that it might have been outside of the particular scope of the project, but would like to hear your thoughts on this. And there's also a second question there, are there ways in which growers, farmers are resisting these trends?
Yeah. There's probably multiple things there. So there are obviously within the global food system very large industrial players, and some of these supply chains, whether it's soybean or even avocados, do feed into supply chains that are sort of really dominated by a large multinational players within the global food system. A lot of there's actually a sort of increasing trend towards public-private partnership type interventions. So national governments working with private sector actors to finance agricultural innovation or to promote markets. And I think as mentioned, there are also international agricultural research and development agencies that have quite a sort of traditionally neoliberal market kind of orientation to them. Again, sometimes working in public-private partnerships, sometimes funded through private philanthropists that sort of further that sort of commercial agriculture agenda as well. So it's quite a variety of organizations, private sector, public sector, that are sort of part of that kind of coalition of actors that are supporting commercialization.
Okay, thank you. I think we now have quite a number of questions, so I'm going to try and get through them quite quickly.
Yeah.
All right, so we have a question from Dr. Adedeji, who is saying, how do we incorporate the hidden middle food system, in brackets, processing, distribution, retailers, food services, and consumers, where food is being wasted and which tends to have an overreaching effect on health? So I think this is more on food waste and loss.
Very big issue across the region and quite a sort of multifaceted issue. It tends to be one that gets kind of reduced down to being an issue of infrastructure and whether there's like adequate storage facilities and transport and logistics. But one of the things that we found, and obviously that is part of the picture, and that kind of opens up to kind of issues around energy security, and there's a whole system around those logistics that generates loss and waste. One of the things that we've found quite interesting in the avocado supply chain is the way in which food quality regulation actually creates waste. The rejections that come with trying to sell into supply chains that are export oriented, and the way that the cost and the burden of those rejections are, as I say, pushed down onto small scale producers that don't necessarily have the information or the bargaining power to negotiate them, I think is a really kind of important and perhaps under researched aspect of the waste problem in these value chains as well. So, really kind of showing that waste is not just a technical issue, but it's also a social governance and power issue within supply chains.
Okay, thank you for that answering that. I also think we are starting to hear more conversation maybe around circular food systems as well. That's an area that we are starting to hear where these sort of middle segments are absolutely critical, especially looking at, food waste in these areas, not only representing economic loss, but having implications for nutrition, environment, and public health in general.
Yeah.
All right, so maybe
Yeah.
let me go to the next question. We have a question from Nora. Uh, Multiple questions from Nora, actually, but maybe let me pick the first one, where she's asking, has there been any research on restoring the indigenous crops removed during colonialization? These crops are disease resistant, high in nutrition, and hardy in harsh climates. Should like to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah. Not not a lot of agronomic research specifically within FoSTA Health, but definitely this is a kind of growing area of interest, and a lot more focus now on how to bring some of those indigenous or orphaned crops kind of back into the mainstream to support farmers' access to seeds, to protect their rights to save seeds, to provide training in more agroecological practices. And that's when I talk about supporting farmers to pursue more positive alternatives, then that is certainly kind of one of those areas for the reasons that Nora suggests, and as issues of reduced soil fertility, crop pests and disease infestations, climate change related extremes, as all of those things become ever greater challenges, there's a strong argument for the solution to those things being, let's go back to those kind of local practices, those indigenous crops that are more nutritious and more resilient. So yeah.
Yeah, and I also think also in light of the geopolitics and fertilizers and, grain not making its way to the region because of the Russia-Ukraine war, and now there's the Middle East war. We are seeing a lot of interest now and a lot of conversations around how do we promote indigenous foods. I think a couple of months ago, FanFan SADC and WFP, we actually launched a SADC regional program on indigenous food value chains. So Nora, I'll be happy to connect with you to share more information on that if you're interested in that some more. But Stephen, there's a question from Anonymous. I'm not sure if being anonymous means this is a tough question, but the question is, how do you think we can better support smallholder farmers to ensure they are able to produce food that meets the required food safety standards? Or better still, how do we manage the pressure the system has applied on them?
Yeah. So there is a sort of knowledge and information gap when it comes to standards in particular, and this isn't about farmers not knowing how to produce their food to a high standard, because they are the ones that know that better than anyone else. The gap is understanding what are the actual sort of compliance requirements and what needs to be documented and monitored in order to meet those standards. And so there is a sort of need for training in that area for those that are entering into those sorts of export markets. And the more information that the farmer has, the better place they are to be able to not only comply with those regulations, but to be able to know, have certainty in what they've done and be able to negotiate for better prices and better contracts. So I would say that the information provision and training is a sort of key part of that of addressing that problem.
Okay. Thank you. Then I think we have about 2 questions, and I see our time is not on our side, but we have a question from Mapenzi, who is asking that after the project, could you share your thoughts on how Africa can pursue food systems transformation in ways that are innovative while still socially just and inclusive for marginalized farming communities?
Yeah, I mean, hopefully that's what I have been sharing some thoughts on. I think just to sort of reiterate some of those broad ideas. So this point about regulating harmful practices, but at the same time providing support for resource poor farmers and producers and consumers to be able to access positive alternatives like agroecology, like more healthy and nutritious diets. I think that's really important. This point about the state having a certain degree of protectionism when it comes to those resource poor farmers and consumers in the context of markets that are moving fast and becoming more liberalized, I think is another really important thing for that, achieving that socially just transition that Mapenzi's referring to. Yeah, and obviously the point about more inclusion in actual decision making at different levels, making sure that our governance processes and decision making are such that there is participation of local perspectives and local knowledges, I think is also essential.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Maybe let's go to Nora's second question. I think I'd only taken one question from Nora. She had asked, I also want to hear your thoughts on the increasing need to farm with animals and the industrialization of animal agriculture when meat was traditionally consumed on special occasions.
So the demand for meat is increasing, as I mentioned, and I think for lots of reasons it's better if that production happens, the production to meet that demand happens in Africa rather than having to be kind of imported in from elsewhere. So again, it's about getting the right balance of regulating that industry in terms of its environmental practices, its social practices, its pricing and marketing, in a way that kind of makes sure that food source is sustainable and affordable, but that also that producers are kind of not regulated so much that it becomes economically inviable, because then what the alternative is that it just comes from import rather than from domestic production. Yeah, so I'm saying a similar response to what I said before, but balancing sort of regulation, promotion of positive alternatives, and protecting the most marginalized.
Okay, thank you. I think in the last dying minutes of of the webinar, there is a question here from Anonymous who says they are part of an academic network on food systems transformation in Zambia, and they want to find out if are there any plans for more engagements with stakeholders in countries, because they believe it'll be great to have some follow-up studies even by local players.
Yeah, probably not under this specific banner of the project, but we work very closely with FANREPAN, have done for a number of years, and I know FANREPAN are very active in sharing research, advocating for policy change, and so that will continue to be, I think, a live channel through which findings from this project and other projects continue to be disseminated and communicated to diverse audiences.
Okay, thank you. I'm not sure if I think I've covered all the questions, Sarah. I don't know if you're seeing one that I'm not seeing here. But I think all the questions you have addressed, Stephen. So thank you very, very much for doing that rapid fire answer for all the questions. And I mean, just thank you for presenting FoSTA Health, especially to some of us that have been part of the 3.5-year journey, but have not sort of taken time to sit back and reflect on the project as a whole. I think it's great work that has been done throughout the 3.5 years, and it'll be good to sort of pick up different threads from the project and follow up with it. But I think it was not just an excellent presentation, but you helped us to also think critically about, the complex relationships between food systems transformation, inequality, health, and environmental sustainability in Southern Africa. I think often enough, the first question that was on the siloed approach to the way governments work, in a lot of ways, it still rings true. We don't think about these things holistically. We just, take our piece of the elephant and just chew on that without worrying about the other bits. But what you have done today is to actually, in a very short space of time, to sort of present a whole picture. So thank you very much, and thank you to the team at GFBI for putting together this webinar. Thank you to the participants for engaging, for the questions. I think the conversation can still go on. There is the website there and the LinkedIn information. You can continue to ask your questions and engage with the team. Thank you.
Thanks, Tanvi. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Cheers.